I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and I get to hang out with Gilbert Cruz from the New York Times Book Review again because we're talking about that list. And you know which list I'm talking about, the 100 best books of the 21st century. And yeah, it's 2024. But Gilbert, I want to talk about the origin of this list. How'd you guys decide? Why now? Why now?
Okay. Well, Miwa, it's great to see you again. Thank you for reminding me what list we were talking about. Why now? All right. Well, next year's 2025. We can talk about like years and numbers, and but the sort of inciting feeling was we sort of had agreed on what the great works of art of the 20th century are, for the most part. Obviously, we're still rediscovering stuff, and when it comes to books are reissued and put out there, and there are new works to discover. But I think we all know generally what the great works of the 20th century are. We know that when it comes to books, we know that when it comes to albums, we know that when it comes to movies, etc. But we're almost a quarter century into this century, and it felt like, all right, let's talk about the now. Let's talk about now, and let's start the conversation. It's very easy when you see a list like this put out, the best books of the 21st century, to feel like it is ending a conversation because a place like the New York Times put it out, and we are, putting it in a box and saying, here you go, these are the greats. But the hope is, and I think this is what happened, that's actually starting a conversation. You can agree, you can disagree, you can say, where's this, where's that, which we will do. As far as why we did it now, very practically, I thought this summer was a pocket before the election, before the conventions, before the Olympics, to get this in. And as an editor, I was concerned that someone would do this idea next year. So I wanted to do it early.
I love the truthfulness of that. I mean, part of it for me was also that it's a chance to talk about books that aren't brand new, right? So technical term, backlist, old books. And there was a lot of stuff that I was looking at initially, and I was like, well, wait a minute, where's that? And then I realized it wasn't published in the 21st century. There's, you get squishy with pub dates, especially when you've been a bookseller for a really long time, like I have. I don't always remember the exact pub date, so I spend a lot of time looking stuff up. Or it's like paperback reissue, and it came out, and oh, that's not the original pub date. So there was a little bit of that for me. But I want to talk about methodology for a second, because there are a couple of, there are 3 authors who had 3 books each. There were a couple of authors who got at least 2. And, when I was running the Discover Great New Writers program in its old iteration for BNN, we kind of had this thing to make space. We were like, you can do it once, and we'll talk about the next books, and we're happy to have you at the table, but you get picked once. And you guys obviously went a different direction. So I'm wondering what that methodology looked like.
Sure. So I'll speak about the methodology as a whole. We reached out to 1,100, 1,200 authors, not authors, people in the book world, right? So those were authors, booksellers, librarians, editors. We excluded agents because we thought the conflict of interest was too great. Academics, people who read books a lot. We reached out to 1,100 of them and said, pick up to 10 books. Ideally, people pick 10, but pick up to 10 books that you would define as best, the best books of the 21st century. We didn't say what best, we didn't sort of give a definition for what best is. We wanted to leave that to people. For some people, it was, the canon. For some people, it was these were the books that gave me the most pleasure. For some people, it was something in between. So he said, pick up to 10 books. The only rules are that had to be published in America, in the English language, which is what the New York Times Book Review primarily covers, and they had to be published after January 1st, 2000. In order to make it easier for people who are participating in this, to prevent the problem that you yourself experienced, saying, when was this published? We took all of our 100 notable books and all of our top 10 books, which are the 2 big lists we do at the end of every year, and we put them all into one big database that was searchable by category and by genre and by year. We didn't restrict it to what was on this list, but we wanted to have a resource that would make it easier for people to remember or to jog their memory as to what came out this century. And those are really the only rules. We did not clearly put a rule saying you can only pick an author once. To me, that was putting the thumb on the scale a little bit too much. Like if there is passion around an author, then there's passion around an author. And we don't want to sort of cut off that passion by saying you only have to pick one, and that is the one that will represent this author. obviously, when any list is put together, the rules define the list, the pool of people that you reach out to define the list, and more importantly, as we discover, the pool of people that respond is really the thing that defines the list in the end. So we reached out to 12 or 1,100 people, immediately discovered a huge percentage of bounce back emails, right? We're just like, oh, we thought we had everyone's contact information. So there were like several weeks of reach out to agents and editors and trying to follow up with people. But then in the end, we got 503 respondents out of, 11 to 1,200 people. And so as much as we said, this is the pool that we are reaching out to and that we would like, we could only control the respondents to a certain extent. We cajoled and we begged and we pleaded, but these 500, which is not a small number, it's not the number we would have liked a bigger one. This is who we got.
Okay, so are you a list maker in real life?
So I have been an arts and culture editor, an arts and culture journalist for 20 years now. And I feel like before I started in this career, I was a list maker.
Right.
And now that it is not a not insignificant part of what I do for my career, I've stopped making lists. I mean, I have a little book back there in which I keep a list of every book I read. I keep a list of every movie I watch in a year, and like my Google Calendar, I will mark what day I watched it. My son is 10 years old, and I've kept a list of every movie that we have shown to him. So yes, I keep lists, but I used to be a great everything. I had books and books and books and books of lists. I've chilled out a little bit now that it's part of my job.
So I'm one of the few people I know who's never kept a list of books I've read. I have never in my life kept
What?
No, I've never in my life. And given what I do, it's kind of funny. I have a mental list.
How do you know?
Because I just remember a lot of stuff and then I forget the books I don't need to know. And sometimes I read something and go, oh, wow, I have read this before.
Wow.
I mean, I also cull my bookcases. This stuff will change. All of it will change. It's, not everything can live where it needs to live. I have recently gone through some storage units where I was like, oh yeah, sorry, you can't live here anymore. But I've just never, ever kept a list. Now, that said, do I like reading other people's lists? Sure. Do I like comparing notes with other people? Sure. I thought it was great that you guys did the reader's response too. And there was, overlap of about a third, I think, roughly?
Yeah, yes. We published this list of the 100 books of the 21st century as chosen by 500 authors, books lovers, people in the industry. But then, look, it's 2024, not 2025, it's 2024. And you can't do an effort like this without, inviting readers to respond in a major way. So not only were we going to ask readers to respond in the comments, which they did heartily, passionately, angrily, enthusiastically, but we also said, we put together the infrastructure that allows us to count up votes of this sort. So why not do the same thing with readers, times subscribers, or times registered users, I believe. It wasn't everyone. You had to be in the Times universe and then present that, because we suspect, this was the theory and it bared out, that their list will be very different from our list. And so I think there were, 61 or so books on the readers' 100 books of the 21st century that were not on ours. And the number one book was very different from ours. It was fascinating. I was so happy that we did it. It just presented within our universe still an alternate sort of view of the century so far.
Well, and also to me, welcome to being a bookseller, right? That's kind of what we stand at, that intersection on any given day where someone comes in and says, I've got the book review from whatever city I'm in, and I would like these 8 books, please. Or you've got someone saying, well, I just saw this on TikTok, or my best friend just told me about this, or it's that constant conversation. And that's what's so interesting to me. Because, I've had customers turn me on to stuff. I've certainly talked to customers about books. I've had fellow booksellers recommend stuff. There's a stack of tiny French novels in translation waiting for me on my desk that honestly came out of a conversation with a colleague where I was like, no idea. I should run downstairs and get those. And when your desk sits on top of one of the largest bookstores in America, you tend to run downstairs a lot, which is great. I can't complain, but there's a lot. And it was funny too, running around my office and sort of collecting copies of what hit both lists. My desk is a little buried right now, and it's usually a little buried, but right now it's really outrageous.
That makes me very happy.
But it was fun. And actually I loved the illustration that you guys did using, whatever edition you had, because there have been times where I have replaced editions of stuff simply because if I'm taking a photo for social, I sort of need to have the most current edition so that we're not causing confusion, because we've all been there. Someone comes in and I said, I remember this jacket. The joke is kind of, there's a blue bird on the cover and it's like, okay, I may know which one you're talking about. And sometimes, I mean, that's half the fun, right? Is figuring out what someone's talking about. But again, I love this idea that we can make older books new, because not everyone's walking around saying, oh, right, that guy, Franzen, that, right.
Absolutely. I mean, I've been in this job basically 2 years now. We're speaking August. And one of the philosophies I brought to this job, which exists at the book review beforehand, but I certainly feel it all the time, is that a book is new if it's new to you, right? So you could take that to the extreme and say, well, why aren't you covering books from the 1940s? If there are books that people haven't read from the 40s, you should be covering that. That's stretching the idea a little too much, but we know that there are great books that came out 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago that people have not read and they should read. And I think it is part of the job of the New York Times Book Review, which is located at a giant media organization and is trying to reach as many readers as possible, to acknowledge that reality and know that you can cover the new all the time, which we're doing, but also figure out and think about ways to return to backlist and think about how to put those books back in front of people. Because we know with this list of 100 books, there are a ton of books on there that, even though they're relatively new, people haven't read, and they should, and that they'll get pleasure out of. And so the idea of thinking about how to cover backlist at the same time they are constantly covering the 5 new books that are coming out every Tuesday is something that we are really thinking about all the time. And this was just, that on a massive scale.
Part of it too, and part of why I love being a bookseller, is watching our art reflect where we are in any given moment in time. Right. Like if I look at stuff that came out in the early 90s, mid 90s, like the amount of change that we've seen, and it's not necessarily just what editors and agents are putting out in the world. It's not just what readers are responding to. It's any number of things. It's also the number of review outlets, right? Like when I started in the business a million years ago and I was a baby publicist, you could send something to Nancy Pate at the Orlando Sentinel. If she really loved it, she put it on the AP Wire and you had 150 hits in like an hour. And that world, that media landscape doesn't exist anymore. Or you could make a regional bestseller because the Chicago Tribune said, oh, hey, wow. So we're living in a really different moment for book coverage. But the enthusiasm for books is pretty consistent. And I love people watching them. Like I wouldn't actually want to see you guys reviewing stuff from the 40s simply because a lot of it just spoke to that moment.
Sure.
And I'm okay if if you want to go find it in the library, that's great. Some of it might be on our shelves or someone else's shelf. But a lot of it, it's okay. Like not every movie survived. Not every piece of music survived.
Absolutely. And we have at the book review, some ways to cover even books like that. We have a newsletter, Read Like the Wind, in which every Saturday, if someone subscribes, they get sort of 2 random super backlist books on a theme, and some of them will be sort of a crime novel from the 40s that maybe people don't know about. And so there are different ways that we try to sort of attack that. I mean, to the point of the landscaping a little different. I love working for the New York Times Book Review because it is big and it is well staffed and it reaches a lot of people. And there's like a pride in working for a big place, but it does not make me feel good as a reader to know that the first place I worked, the Tuscaloosa News, which used to have a guy who would review books, probably doesn't have that anymore. And the Orlando Sentinel maybe doesn't have a reviewer. And the Minnesota Star Tribune maybe doesn't have a reviewer. And that thing, which was real up to 15 years ago, is just not the case anymore. And so I'm of 2 minds, which is it's great to work for the book review, but if we're one of the only places that are doing it on this scale, that's bad for readers. And it's a real Jekyll and Hyde situation sometimes.
Yeah. Did you have a chance to read Kyle Chayka's Filterworld?
Honestly, I read quarter, the first quarter of it.
You know the basic premise, right? Like he's basically just saying the internet is essentially flattened cultural conversation. Like you can sit in a coffee shop in Boise and it looks exactly like Brooklyn and whatnot. And he's not wrong. And I do think in so many ways the internet has been good. I am not a Luddite. I'm not picking on the internet. It has made my life infinitely easier in a lot of ways. What's fascinating to me is how the discourse changes. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have a multitude of voices. There are a lot of bookstagrammers I follow. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening. But we still have lots of big emotions about books. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you think about the comfort you find or the community you find, books connect us to our humanity in a way that can be challenging for some folks, not so challenging for others. I mean, maybe I've had a couple of things airborne when I finished reading them and not proud. And I do avoid glass things when I do that. But to see people engaging this way with words and ideas and emotion, right?
Yeah.
Is kind of great. It's really great.
I agree. Look, as I said, I've been doing lists on the internet for quite a while. And there's a line that people have around lists, which is like, it's clickbait, which I feel like is, we litigated this like 20 years ago. Why are we still doing this? But to me, a list done in good faith, and what I mean by that is like, there's a concept behind it. There's a methodology. There's rigor. It's not just put out there in order to anger people. Even the best list done in good faith is going to anger people. It's going to, get people talking about what is on there, what is not on there. Why are they doing this? Why do you need to rank art? Which to me, that whole, well, you can't put books against it. Yes, you can. We put art against each other all the time. Like, let's not be naive about this. I was pleased with the way that this was received because at a time when there was a lot of crazy stuff going on in American news, somehow every day for 5 days, there was a ton of people talking about books.
Yeah.
And if you thought it was an interesting list, I'm happy. If you thought it was a BS list, I'm also happy because the only way you thought it was BS is if you looked at it. If you said, I would not have put those books on here, I would have put these books on here. And to have done a thing that sort of inspires people to argue about books is not, to me, like success. It was not done cynically. It was not done with anything other than a spirit of like, we love books. We think these are good. Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you disagree, let us know.
I liked being able to check off the ones I'd read because it kept me from having to make a spreadsheet.
Absolutely. So many people have told me about the checking.
I honestly, well, also, I knew you and I would be talking about this. So I was like, I should figure out how many of these I've actually read. So the number is 68. I left off anything I didn't finish. I included a couple of books that were airborne because I did actually finish them. And just because they went airborne after I finished them doesn't mean they couldn't be on the list.
And airborne doesn't mean you read them while you were on the medication airborne. It means you threw them across the room.
Oh, they went flying. I still have a pretty solid arm.
It's so funny because whenever I read that in a book or I threw the book across the room, I say to myself, no one does that. But
no,
apparently
I do.
You do.
I do.
Okay.
I might be the last person who does, but yes, there have been times where I have responded with great vigor to something someone has read. But I think the device, and again, I don't keep lists. I do show prep. I needed to know. Yeah. But so again, 68, I was like, that seems about right, actually. Maybe a little more. It was only a handful of things. The difference for me came on the readers list. I was like, okay. And I absolutely get it. But I was like, oh yeah, missed that. Read that one, not that one. Oh, definitely did not finish that. But again, like I love the idea that they all coexist together, right?
I mean, again, 61 books appearing on the reader list that did not appear on the main list. Right. And a lot of sort of like high, literary adjacent or literary bestsellers, right? And so the number one was Barbara King's on the reader list. Number one was Barbara Kingsolver's Even Copperhead, which was on ours. But, 2 and 3, I forget what order it was Anthony Doerr and Amor Towles, which did not appear on the list. There were multiple Amor Towles on there. Gone Girl was on the reader list, which was not on our list. There were just so many books that people are passionate about that were on the reader list that were not on the main one. And the thing is, think about how many books come out in America in the English language every single year and multiply that by 2+ decades. It's a lot of books. So 100, well, it seems like a lot, maybe. It's actually not that many. Like, it's a small percentage. So I think, and I can't even remember, luckily for me, so I don't have to speak about it, what like 100 to 150 on our list was, or even 150 to 200. But I can assure you that those are great books. Like, there are, there's not like, just because 100 is the great number that we understand when it comes to big lists doesn't mean that everything that is not on there is not of value. And I think you probably could say, Gilbert, there were these authors that were not on this list. There were these books that were not on this list. What the hell are you guys thinking?
I do have a list. I have a list. I should also say I did not return my ballot, so sorry about that. I just saw it in my email later, and I was like, oops.
I did double check that before I agreed to do this.
My email was a little bonkers, and I was like, oh dear. Oh, wow. Whoops.
Well, this is what I was talking about when I said it was difficult. you think you can easily reach people, but it's actually harder than you think, even when you have their email address.
Okay, listen, I promise the next time we do it, I won't miss the
Okay, yeah, when we do it again in 5 years.
Yes. But, I mean, again, there is nonfiction on this list that I love. I mean, Behind the Beautiful Forevers, Kate Boo. Like, we're talking about 2 kids living in the slums in India. And the way she wrote about the book, that book had a moment where it was absolutely on fire and literally everyone was reading it. Mm-hmm. And, there's this sort of conventional, people will read this, people won't read this. I'm like, a good story well told, people will read. I mean, Patrick Radden Keefe, Say Nothing. Again, like the IRA, give someone a really great story well told, and I promise you, they will go down the rabbit hole. We just have to put it in front of them.
Absolutely.
So how do you choose what you read? Fiction, nonfiction, genre, not genre? I mean, you've talked about the fact that there's not a ton of genre on this list, and it is kind of noticeable.
Yeah. So wait, how do I choose what I read in general? Or
yeah, not necessarily for work. You as a reader.
There's no not for work.
Well, there's that.
I'm sorry to tell you. The wonderful and somewhat terrible thing about this is that when you are the editor of the book review, or even when you are an editor at the book review, it always feels like whatever you're reading is for work. When I was the TV editor at the New York Times, it was the same thing. I was like, well, I guess I'm watching this I'm either watching it for work, or I'm reading it for work, or I'm watching or reading it in order to be a better person at my job. So I can be more well-informed. But I, luckily, really read across the spectrum. I love fiction. I love nonfiction. I love the genre that we call literary fiction, and I love other genres. I've spoken on this podcast, I believe, about liking horror. I like thrillers. I like fantasy. I'm not as well read in romance, which is maybe cliched, given that I'm a 40-something-year-old man. But I did go on vacation with my family over spring break, and I did bring an Emily Henry book with me, and I read it. And so I really am trying. But it seems like this giant world that is hard to break into. But I try to read really across all genres and all types. Fiction, nonfiction. I probably could read more poetry, to be honest. And, I've had emails from people saying, it's embarrassing that there's not more poetry on this list. This would never happen in Europe, one person said. I did not write back, but I thought, well, this is not Europe, my friend. This is the US of A.
One of the things I did want to point out, though, for listeners, if you're looking for genre, there are books on this list that will blow up the ideas of ghost stories or fantasy. Underground Railroad, right? Case in point. Station 11, The Road. I mean, there is stuff on here that you trust. The Hernan Diaz. Oh, wow. Like a book about a book that's just kind of bonkers, but it's so great. But he plays with genre. I mean, Never Let Me Go.
I think that is one of the things that maybe speaks to a trend from this century, if we want to talk about that, which is the mashup, the mixing of genre and literary fiction. Underground Railroad, gorgeously written, Pulitzer Prize winning novel that is speculative in its own way. Never Let Me Go, written by a Nobel Prize winner, that's essentially sort of like a dystopian science fiction novel. Station 11, The fifth season, which maybe is the only like straight genre book on there. The Road, dystopian fiction written by one of America's sort of dark masters. There is this thing where you see these great writers feeling more comfortable with writing in or adjacent to genre.
I mean, David Mitchell has made an entire career out of it. Cloud Atlas, though, is the book that kind of really put him on the map in the US. But it opens with sort of a classic 1840s, like, am I reading Patrick O'Brien? What is happening here? Yeah. And then, hi. Was not expecting any of that. But I mean, he popped up in a moment where not a lot of folks had been doing that. Underground Railroad popped up in a moment where not a lot. And it's kind of great the way these books now have a toehold. And I keep saying to folks, I'm like, just don't look at the flap copy. Just start reading. And I promise you, because the voice, right? Like I read for voice first. Stuff doesn't necessarily have to happen. Just give me a voice that I can hold on to. And I don't necessarily need to like characters either. I just need a voice. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure as a bookseller and all the booksellers that you know and work with on a regular basis, you have to know what questions to ask of people when they come to you in order to discern whether or not they are someone who cares about voice, or someone who cares about style, there's someone who cares about plot primarily, there's someone who, if there's a narrator or a protagonist who is nasty or dark or unlikable, that will turn them off. There are those people, and what they like and what they dislike are equally valid, particularly when you're trying to like put the right book in their hands. Did anything actually surprise you when you were working on this? I mean, it's you and your entire team, so maybe we're pulling in people from your team as well, but were you guys really super surprised? Some people on my team were surprised that there weren't more books from the past few years on there. I think, Demon Copperhead, Trust, and Stay True, all of which were Pulitzer winners in the year in which they came out, maybe were the most recent ones. I was surprised. This is nothing to do with the quality of the book, which I think is high, that Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow was on there. I'm not surprised it was on the readers list, but I was surprised it came in at number 76, that of all the books that have come out in the past 4 to 5 years, that was one of the ones that made it on. It just speaks to the intense passion for that book. It was a book club pick for us. It was a really easy book club pick. All right, so you knew. It was a monthly pick last. Yeah, we knew. I mean, part of it is, again, she's playing with genre too, though. I mean, totally. We've had people say, well, it's a novel about video games. And I'm like, well, actually, it's kind of not. I mean, I remember like Pong and Tetris and things like that, but it's not a video game novel. It's an odd thing to say, because it's a book that is set within, that's what they do for work, but that's not how you describe other books. You don't look at a book and say, people are lawyers or accountants in the book, so this is a book about accounting. It's just, I think it honestly, as someone who plays video games, it speaks to the sort of weird space that video games still occupies in our world, where one of the most popular media out there, but yet people particularly that care about books see it as like this other thing. I think there are possibly some readers who may have lost some time I think we're competing with video games in a way that people were not particularly expecting to, in terms of just entertainment hours. I mean, there was a moment, obviously, where television really took over reading. I think we just go through phases in the culture where it's just like people start doing other stuff, and sometimes books fall by the wayside. I mean, I love short stories. I'm a big believer in you can read a short story on your phone while you're waiting in line. And, there are plenty of people who would just rather scroll through Instagram or TikTok, and that's their gig, and that's fine. But me, honestly, I am going to squeeze out a short story while I'm standing there, because I would prefer to engage with, my sort of, I don't know. I'd rather read a story on my phone. And actually, my brother read the entire Keith Richards bio on his phone on vacation. I was like, dude, how did you get through 1,200 pages of Keith Richards on your phone? He's like, I forgot to bring a book and I downloaded it. And there you can fly through that book. It is propulsive. Yeah, that is totally true. Do you listen to audiobooks? I do. And I listen to them partly for my job, which is it's a way to sort of like always have a book on. I'm reading The God of the Woods at the moment, and I have You're going to fly through that. You are going to
I'm three-quarters of the way done,
Yep.
but the way I've gotten to three-quarters of the way done is I have that copy over there, and then it's also on my phone. And when I'm washing dishes, when I'm walking the dog, if I am getting to bed, but my eyes are tired, I will just put it on for 10 minutes. So yeah, I listen to a ton of podcasts too, if you want to talk about something that is competing for readers' attention, not only video games and TV, but podcasts. Listen to a lot of podcasts, but I also listen to a ton of audiobooks all the time.
And I just want to say again, this really should go without saying, but listening to audiobooks really is reading. And I see lots of weird discourse about if you're listening to the book, it's not reading. And I'm like, no, it's reading.
I've seen that said. And I don't understand at a time when 50% of Americans don't read. The latest numbers were released last year, I think. When you have that many Americans that don't read, to put up any barriers to the definition of what constitutes reading just seems very perverse to me.
Also, there are times, I mean, the first time I read Empire of Pain, Patrick Radden Keefe's second book about the Sacklers and Purdue Pharma and the opioid crisis, I was so mad I kept putting it down because, I mean, it's an enraging story, and he does all of the legwork. He follows the money, he follows the family, and it's a really intense reading experience. And I was prepping for an interview with him, and I listened to it the second time, and he reads it, and he's so calm. And I was like, oh, maybe I should have listened to it the first time because I got so wrapped up and I was so mad at these people. And I was still mad the second time, but having the experience of sort of the author standing between the actual sort of facts of the story and my experience of the story, I was like, oh.
And there's a difference too, for some, certainly not for all, between fiction and nonfiction when it comes to audiobooks. I certainly find, or I used to find at least, that nonfiction was easier for me because if I missed a fact or something, it's fine. I can keep moving on. But if I miss a character motivation, if I was listening to a piece of fiction, that could ruin your understanding of everything that happens, thereon after. And so there is this sort of, to me at least, this difference between listening to a piece of nonfiction, which can sometimes feel like listening to just a podcast because it is information that's being conveyed to you and hopefully it's being conveyed well, and listening to a piece of fiction, which you really need to understand what is happening both internally and externally with characters.
I was thinking about, too, if you do this list again in 5 years, there are a couple of, more than a handful of books that were published this year that I understand completely why they're, I mean, I'm talking about like January of this year, March of this year, stuff like that. But I do think some of the additions would include like Kaveh Akbar's Martyr or Hanif Abdurraqib's There's Always This Year, and Chain Gang All-Stars, which was late last year. I mean, there are things.
Are you just saying that because those books are right behind your right
actually,
ear there?
I do love them, and they will stay there. But I want to go back to something you said at the top of the show about best and not defining best. And I do think that was a good move on the part of you and the editors, just saying, okay, let the reader define it. Reading is such an intimate experience, right? And I argue about canon all the time. Like, I do think we need to redefine canon. I think we need to rework stuff. And I say this as a person who's just coming to The Adventures of Augie March now. I know I am so late on that book. And I'm enjoying it. It's great. I totally understand. I don't know why I didn't get to it until now. I'm here now. And I'm a bookseller. So the idea that we would have static ideas of what it means to be best, static ideas of canon, this is exactly the place where we should be messing around with our definitions.
Canon is definitely a word we didn't want to use, and I haven't really used it to refer to this at all, and I've made it a point to avoid doing so because it is a fraught word. It is a word that reeks of, white male academia, exclusionary as much as inclusionary, or more so even. And the idea was to try to think about this as kind of a living document, a snapshot of a moment in time that maybe would change in the future. One of the inspirations was, I've said this before, the Sight and Sound Best Films of All Time poll. So for those listeners who don't know what this is, Sight and Sound is a film journal published out of London, wonderful film journal. And every year since, I believe, 1952, every 10 years, they take a poll in an attempt to figure out what the best movies of all time are. And in 1952, they started with a very small group of people, and then it's grown and it's grown and it's grown. And every 10 years, there's a different portrait painted of the best movies of all time. And for a very long time, Citizen Kane was the one that was always at the top of the list. And then Vertigo, the Alfred Hitchcock movie, was the one that was on top of the list. And then 2 years ago, I believe in 2022, when the latest 10-year poll was taken, it was a French movie by a female director, right? And the way you get there is by growing your respondent list, right? Mm-hmm. It's just, it used to be a small thing, now it's a big thing, and it presents a completely different picture. And so this is a moment in time. This poll was taken in May of 2024, and 500 people chose these. If we do it 5 years from now, if we do it 10 years from now, if we had done this in July as opposed to May, the list would probably look different. I can tell you, given what we have read, maybe you wouldn't have 2 Alice Munro books on that list if you did it in July as opposed to May, right, after that Toronto Star piece came out as opposed to before, right? And so, I want it to be a resource that people use to find books that they haven't read, but I also don't want it to feel like, this is the big monolith from 2001. And if you haven't read these books, you are not well read.
Yeah, I think that whole idea of well read versus not well read. I mean, I've had people say to me, knowing full well what I do for a living, I don't read. And I'm just like, well, I'm sorry. I think you just haven't read. You haven't found the book that's going to make you into a reader. And I think that happened for a lot of people, but I do genuinely believe that there is a book for everyone. And it may not be the same book. And there are times where you see a book take off, and I'm not going to name names, but there are times where you see something take off, and my first thought is, who is left to read that? But you know what? Great. Welcome to the party. We're delighted to see you. Here's a copy. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you come back for more. But I do have moments of, you see these numbers, and you're just like, okay, who is left? And people come to books however they come to books. And sometimes it's through the Times or another outlet. And sometimes it is just a friend or a neighbor or a colleague saying, oh, there's this thing. Or even, there are a lot of folks reading George R.R. Martin again because what's currently on HBO. Mm-hmm. And it's always interesting to me to see how people come to the books that they love. And my definition of best changes all the time. It's partially why I don't keep lists. Because it's just like, It's, for me, my engagement with books is always evolving. And I remember what I need to remember. I forget what I need to forget. And sometimes the two meet in the middle, which is great. But yeah, it's just, it should always be changing, right? Like, at least for me, that's kind of how I see it. What are you thinking about podcasting too? I mean, you've added new shows from Colson, Whitehead, Min Jin Lee, George Saunders. How many more extra episodes?
We're going to have 2 more. And so we do a weekly podcast, the book review podcast. We will have interviewed 5 of the authors on the list and sort of gone on a deep dive with them about their books. It was very practically, it's like, is this an opportunity to sell some ads on an additional podcast? And it was. Someone was interested. And then I said, oh, that was just an idea I had. I didn't know we were actually going to have to do it. Now I have to reread all of these books or read some of them for the first time. But I will say, I've talked to Colson, Min Jin Lee, and George Saunders, and hearing them reflect on their books and being able to sort of talk in detail about their books in a way that maybe they wouldn't have been able to when they were doing the press tour for the first time, because they couldn't have assumed that people had read the entirety of the book at that point. It's just a whole different experience. Yeah. And they're able to reflect on it years later. You're able to talk to Colson Whitehead about the second to last chapter of the Underground Railroad. It's just, it's been a delight.
Yeah, no, and it's fun to listen to too, because I mean, obviously we stay spoiler free in our conversations because you never know when someone's going to stumble on something. Sure. And, and you were able to have that conversation that not everyone gets to have with Colson. But like, I remember when Underground Railroad was coming out and it felt different. And I'd been reading him since The Intuitionist. That had been a Discover pick that predated me. And he was always doing something interesting. Like Sag Harbor, his coming of age novel, that was his 4th book. Like, I love Apex Hides the Hurt, which is essentially his 9/11 novel about the nomenclature specialist. But suddenly Underground Railroad just felt like his writing felt different. I don't know. Sometimes you just get a, feeling at the back of your neck and then sort of the hair stand up and you're like, and then Oprah. And it just, everything happened and it was great. And, listening to Min talk about the jacket for Pachinko, I remember getting my galley and thinking, this is so beautiful and no one in America knows what a Pachinko machine is.
Absolutely. George Saunders in the last one we did talked about the thing he had experienced several times in the first few months, which is hearing from people that they couldn't get past the first 30 pages or that they had to put it down after the first 30 pages when reading Lincoln and Bardo, because you need to commit until you understand the format of the book,
right,
and the rhythm and what it is and what it is not. And, sort of him seeing in real time, not just theoretically, what it took for people to actually get into it. Once they got into it, they were sort of hooked. But it did have this little hump at the beginning. And hearing him reflect on that was fascinating.
I can't wait to hear the next two because I'm wondering, I'm just like, who is it going to? I mean, I have an idea. I know.
Trying to book them still. I mean, the problem.
Seriously? Okay.
Well, the problem with this is just trying to figure out the right mix of people. And we're doing them on video to clip them out to social platforms, which we usually don't do. And so it's just more planning than usual. And I do all the planning. And so it's just a lot of work.
I know the feeling. I know the feeling.
I know you do.
Okay. So you mentioned it before, and now we go there. But dude, Louise Erdrich, Jacqueline Woodson.
Okay, so the person who did not take the survey.
I know.
Who could not find the time to take the survey.
Sorry.
No. What do you wish had been on there?
I mean, I think for Erdrich, it could have been either Night Watchman or The Roundhouse. And with Jacqueline Woodson, it could have been either Another Brooklyn, which I deeply love.
Right there. There you go. Yeah.
Another Brooklyn, which I deeply love, or Brown Girl Dreaming. I would have stuck to one only because more room for people. I do think Beth Macy's Dope Sick would have been a good nonfiction edition. I think she does stuff with voice there that is really grounded in a way because she comes out of tiny newspapers like you come out of tiny newspapers. I think her first paper was Rural Virginia, if I remember correctly. And then, Homeland Elegies, the Ayat Akhtar.
Yeah.
His sort of play on Saul Bellow and Ravelstein, only different. And Julia Otsuka, When the Emperor Was Divine. And that goes back to voice. Like that to me is a combination of talking about a moment for America where we really, incarcerated our own citizens, right? But she turns that horrific moment into a serious piece of art. And it's like 120 pages. It's tiny. Like you can do a lot in a novella. And Claire Keegan obviously was on both lists and she's doing really great stuff. But was it a novella that you picked or the story? Oh, no, it was the novella.
What, Claire Keegan?
Claire Keegan. Was it the story collection or was it?
That was, hold on. That was Small Things Like These.
Oh, okay. Foster is the one that I kind of really super love. And Charles Yu, Interior Chinatown, feels like he's doing stuff with form and story in a way that I think that book is going to have legs. And for me, when I'm thinking about sort of, and I ran the Discover program from summer of 11 until we transitioned it to a title a month. So like 8 years. And you're always kind of thinking to legacy, but there's always a really good chance you're just going to get it wrong. Like there were times where we put books in and I was like, why is this not working? And sometimes stuff just doesn't work.
One of the interesting things to do is go back and read review for me to go back and read reviews that we published in the New York Times Book Review and to understand that there are not an insignificant number of times when we were maybe not correct about a book, right? And so we have staff critics at the New York Times Book Review, Dwight Garner, Jen Zalai, Alexandra Jacobs, A.O. Scott. But we use primarily outside writers, right? That's part of the reason we thought in the first place to go out to all these people because they're sort of in our orbit already. We use so many of these novelists in particular to review for us. And the thing that's always crazy is when I or another editor loves a book, we find what we think is the right person to review it. They write it and they hated the book. They're like, well, damn. I guess this is what's running in the New York Times Book Review because you can't tell your writer the opinion to have, right? It's
Right,
just like that
right.
is how they reacted to the book. And this is true across all criticism.
Yeah.
I mean, Tony Scott, A.O. Scott, wrote a book about criticism, and he says, one of the functions of a critic is to be wrong. That happens more often than you think. That a critic is wrong about something, the goal of a critic is not to be right, is not to be wrong, but to genuinely engage with a piece of work. And so going back, I think I said in the Colson Whitehead interview and reading Jonathan Franzen's review of his first book, The Intuitionist, and Jonathan Franzen saying, yeah, I don't know, Colson Whitehead, he doesn't write, female characters very well, or whatever it was. It's fascinating to sort of go back and see that we don't necessarily understand a piece of art at the time that it is being released, which is why I think efforts like this list, for good or ill, can be instructive, because it sort of shows you, in some sense, what rises to the top, even though, as you point out, there are hundreds of great books that could have been on here that are not.
But I think the conversation is the most important piece. And that's the thing I would just want to keep stressing. It's just the more we can keep books in the conversation. And it's not just an online conversation. It's not just a podcast conversation. It's not just in the pages of the New York Times. I'm literally talking about going to a dinner party and maybe talking about a book to the person you're seated next to, or,
sure,
waiting online. And you say, I used to love to sort of look at what people were reading on the subway or on planes. And now, honestly, everyone's on a device, so you can't snoop. And
yeah, I know.
I kind of miss the days of snooping at what people are reading, or like, what edition is that? So I would just like to see that kind of come back, because again, it's all about the connection, right? Like whether you're connecting with the author or the subject, or like some human being walking next to you or sitting next to you, whatever. That's what I'm hoping we get to sort of kick back out into the world.
I too, as someone who's lived in New York almost my entire life, miss riding the subway and seeing what people are reading. Sometimes you do, and then sometimes I do, and when I do, I feel like I'm being extra creepy because I'm really sort of looking at the cover of the book in a way that I don't think people do anymore. But I can't help myself.
But it's kind of what we do. Books are fun. They're interesting. They're smart. They're weird. They're provocative. There are a million different things, but also there's a little bit of the business piece to it. Like you can't always predict. I mean, we would all like to be able to predict what something's going to do and how it's going to do it and when it's going to do it. And sometimes you just kind of go, okay, cool.
It's hard to keep away if you're a book person. I mean, we just went on I talked about this spring break trip we went on a summer vacation with our child, and poor guy, whenever he is with us on vacation, he just has to put up with us going to like 10 bookstores over the course of a week. And by halfway through, he has had it. He's like, you can see it. He's like, it's great that you love books this much, but this is boring to me. I'm a 10-year-old and I'm just going to sit in this corner and wait until you're done. But can't help it. It's just, I got to see this one. I got to see this one. And we're here. Let's go to this other bookstore.
And that's my idea of fun, but it happens.
It's the way it is. The way it is.
Gilbert, thank you so much for joining us on Port Over. It's always fun to see you. So we got to figure out what the next thing is going to be.
Okay.
I mean, we should
know where to find me.
I know. We'll make this a regular date. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.